Welcome to our discussion on competition at sea, building resilience in a maritime enterprise in crisis. I'm Mark Kennedy, Director of the Wahba Institute for Strategic Competition here at the Wilson Center. I want to thank the Polar Institute for co-sponsoring this event and the work that Rebecca Pincus and Elizabeth Donnelly have done, along with Kira, have really made this a success. The Wahba Institute focuses on how the U.S. with its allies can do a better job of projecting mutually beneficial economic power around the world. And in this regard, we have a lot of work to do in the maritime enterprise, which is truly in crisis. We did a panel in Miami that gathered many people around with the Miami port and looked in depth at the maritime enterprise, and came out of that with some recommendations that we need to do more to invest in infrastructure and have a freight strategy. When you think of what the tragic action in Baltimore has resulted in, that will remind all of us of the importance of infrastructure in general, as well as ports in specific. And we hope that is a wake-up call. Out of that, we've also continued our investigation. More recently, Jeff Cusick's with us here today, partnered with me in writing a piece calling for a comprehensive maritime strategy. Because besides just ports in the U.S., ports around the world, with China having ownership interests in over 90 ports, and shipbuilding that is constraining the size of our Navy and Coast Guard, and many more issues are vitally important. So I'm thrilled to have you here. I will just say that we're going to be having questions at the end after our rock star panelists give some opening remarks. Please make sure you push the green button on when you talk. If you get too close on the inside, you'll be part of the show here, given that we're all on camera. But we do have a rock star group. It begins with Jonathan Caverly, who's a professor at the Center for Naval Warfare Analysis at the U.S. Naval War College and a research affiliate at the Security Studies program at MIT. He's going to start out giving us a broad overview. Then we're going to have Leah Thome, a Schwartzman Fellow here at the Wilson Center, who's been doing a lot of great research on China's interest in ports and what that could mean for the U.S. And then we're going to have our cleanup act being Ronald O'Rourke, who's the naval analyst at the Congressional Research Service at the Library of Congress, an expert on shipbuilding and many more things. So we'll be kicking it off with the panel, who will start out with some short introductory remarks. Then we're going to be looking forward to your questions. So let me turn it over to you, Jonathan, to give us a broad overview of this topic.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Rebecca Pincus, for bringing me out. As an employee of the Naval War College, I have to start with a disclaimer. These opinions are mine. They don't represent that of the college, United States Navy, United States Department of Defense, United States government. Just looking at who's here and who's on the dais with me, this is like the Star Wars cantina of maritime issues. It's like a motley collection, but if you need something hard done, this is probably the first place to go, so I'm really happy to be here. I was going to give a broad overview of maritime resilience, but Jeff and Mark stole my thunder with just an essential read in War on the Rocks this morning. I invite you all to read it. I hope it's linked on the Wilson website, because it really does very succinctly and very quickly cover a great deal of the issues. So the only criticism I really have of it is that its comprehensiveness has forced me to completely rewrite my comments. So I'm making this up on the fly, so bear with me. It's no secret that building a resilient maritime capability for the United States and the global order is incredibly complicated. I know the Wilson Center is dedicated to trying to come up with executable solutions to some of this, but we're going to have to become much more confused before we get there. And so I think we're all going to be in a much worse place if we do our job right for the next couple hours, because this is one of the most complex institutions in global history, and we're trying to manage it. That's a very daunting task. So I'm going to talk a bit about how this complexity plays out in geopolitics. So what does maritime resilience applied to sort of international politics looks like? And I'm going to specifically focus on People's Republic of China coercion, economic coercion of Taiwan, and how does maritime capability help or hinder the United States' approach to that. It's not a hard scenario to imagine. If we think of Speaker Pelosi's visit in 2022, that was basically a dress rehearsal that could be easily scaled up to basically isolate Taiwan economically for as long as the PRC wants, as comprehensively as the PRC wants. You could imagine a blockade that would result in a customs inspection, live fire exercises that would keep a lot of the major ports closed, but maybe leave a minor port on the West Coast open for calories and maybe some coal and petroleum. And so you have this soft blockade that causes tremendous economic damage, but actually doesn't cause a humanitarian catastrophe. And that will put the rest of the world in a bind. So real quick, I'm going to talk very quickly about three things. First, I'm going to talk about the relative maritime resilience of the three actors, Taiwan, China, and the United States. The second thing I'm going to emphasize is in this scenario, there are a bunch of nested timelines where different important actors act at a different pace. And that's really important to understand and appreciate how complex that is. And then finally, I'm going to put a little more analysis on the levers in the short and midterm that are available to the United States to pull and why they're not terribly attractive. So real quick on the relative resilience. Taiwan's obviously an island. It's the fifth largest recipient of container ships. 15,000 container ships arrive every year. It has no merchant fleet to speak of in terms of flags or even ownership. It imports almost all of its energy. It does have relatively robust oil and gas reserves, but relatively limited liquid natural gas reserves, and I think that's important. It's not as vulnerable when it comes to sustenance. It actually has a pretty good reserve of calories stockpiled. One thing that is not appreciated is that the east coast of Taiwan, the part that faces the Pacific of the United States, is very underdeveloped in terms of port infrastructure. So basically, something like liquid natural gas can only be imported into Taiwan from the west coast, which is obviously right across the strait from Taiwan. If you think about the PRC has very systematically acquired months of food and energy reserves. It has a robust integrated air defense system, and the Department of Defense publishes numbers every year. There's about 3,000 missiles at least that can easily range the entire island and the littoral of this region. Has a very robust space and non-spaced ISR, so the surveillance capability, so it has the ability to track and target almost anything in the region, and that's pretty redundant. It has significant cyber capabilities, and if you think about it, like a ship at sea doesn't have much cyber vulnerability, but ports are extremely vulnerable to cyber attack. And again, we had a test drive in August 2022. There's both the maneuvering of the fleets, there were missile tests, but there was also cyber operations on Taiwan. The other thing I want to emphasize is if you think about an economic blockade of Taiwan, that would cause significant ripples in the global economy, right? But if you tried to escalate and do the same thing to China, right, that would be economy shattering, right? So if you think about all the different players that have to cooperate when it comes to responding to economic coercion of Taiwan and what are their economic incentives, it is not a pretty picture. Okay, I don't want to beat a dead horse because you should read Mark's piece in War on the Rocks. The United States has a very limited reserve fleet of merchant ships that can mobilize in 5 to 10 days. It has a maritime security program of tankers, 10 oil tankers that are out plying their trade on a day-to-day basis around the world. There is no liquid natural gas tanker in the tanker security program. China and Hong Kong own about 18.5% of the world's tonnage. The United States owns about 2.3%. That said, our treaty allies own a very significant portion of the the global merchant fleet. But that leads me to timelines. Okay, so now that we've kind of set the stage of the relative vulnerability of the three actors, all right, I want to emphasize how a timeline for an economic blockade would unfold after it was announced, okay? First, ships that are at sea can respond instantly, right, with just a push of a button. They could change course, they could change ownership, and they could change a flag, okay? And they could even probably tell you what the manifest is or change the manifest to what they're carrying. All right, this is a very hard problem to stay on top of because it changes so rapidly. Global industry will immediately rush in and out of China to get their products in and out of markets before the United States or other countries escalate. So you're going to suddenly see this rush of ships in and out of China. While semiconductors is small and you don't need a giant merchant ship to take semiconductors around the world, the primary inputs into Taiwan, all right, are pretty easy to slow down. And so over a week or so, you're actually going to see some ripples in semiconductor production. United States mobilization, right? If the United States decides to mobilize either its tanker security fleet, tanker fleet, or decides to mobilize its Navy, all right, that's going to provide weeks of INW, informational warning, to both China, but also commercial actors around the world. So there's no instantaneous response by the United States on that front. And finally, supply chain disruptions generally take about 6 to 8 weeks to actually work its way through the economy before it starts affecting consumers. Okay, so right there you have these nested timelines that are really important to understand when you think about economic coercion. Okay. Now, in the short, midterm, maybe long term, we want to think about the United States developing a more robust commercial maritime resilience. Okay, I don't have a ton of good news on that because one thing that's not appreciated as much as it should be is that the global maritime industry is a tough business everywhere you go. All right, we talk about the loss of shipbuilding capacity in the United States. Okay, consolidation in the worldwide shipbuilding industry is massive. So there were 700 shipyards around the world in 2007. There's now 300 in 2022. Around that time, we had the world had the ability to deliver about 2,000 vessels a year. That's down to 1,300. Global backlogs for these shipyards are enormous, and yet the shipbuilding industry cannot make money. All right, these requires massive government subsidies. The public report of profit margins by the Chinese Shipbuilding Association was something like 4%. And whether or not you believe that, that's up to you, but that's pretty low margins when it comes to manufacturing. South Korea is having a very hard time keeping its shipyards profitable. There's a global labor shortage everywhere, okay? If you go to a South Korean shipyard, you're gonna see a lot of signs of Vietnamese because there are tons of guest workers actually building these ships in South Korea. Okay, so in terms of the ability to turn on a dime, in terms of ability to start making ships as a response, it is very hard. Once you lose the ability to make something as complicated as a ship, right, it's very hard to get it back, okay? And so the idea that we're going to turn on a dime in the United States and actually start building commercial ships effectively, that's going to take a very heavy lift. That's going to take a very long time. Okay, to sum up, China seems to have operational advantages in all three areas I just talked about, okay? The operational balance for China, Taiwan, and the United States in terms of resilience, the nested timelines for the various actors that are pivotal to this scenario, and the levers that could be pulled in the medium and long term. Okay, so I just want to conclude that when we think, as a naval strategist, when I think about really scary propositions, I think of the massive loss of life and resources that a cross-strait invasion and counter-invasion would result in. Okay, but when I think of operational problems, I think given the complexity and the number of things that have to go right and the operational balance, I find a blockade and counter-blockade of Taiwan much more hard to deal with. And so I think, frankly, the United States and, frankly, the world needs to think a lot more about this now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Caverly. Very much appreciate that oversight. We're going to now turn to Leah Thome to give us a broad overview of her research.
Thank you so much, Mark, for having me here today. Thank you, Becca, too, and thank you so much to John and Ronald for being here today to discuss with me, too. I have long followed both of your works. I'm very excited to be here today. As someone who primarily studies U.S.-China relations and issues of international security, one of the biggest challenges I truly see to U.S. maritime resilience and the maritime enterprise is the PRC's often year-long, if not decade-long, advance in maritime commerce, infrastructure, and followingly so, the PRC now moving to close the gap also in issues of maritime security abroad. And there's three topics that I would really like to draw out here today: China's investments in foreign ports outside of its borders, the establishment of dual use and military access abroad at maritime locations, as well as understanding China's strategy and cohesively responding to it as part of the US government. Talking about China's investment into foreign ports, investing in maritime commerce has been a year-long strategy of the PRC, which has been highlighted by the inception of the 2013 Belt and Road Initiative and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Route, especially in locations of maritime importance alongside vital maritime choke points and shipping lanes. Here I would like to reference a November 2023 CFR report that outlined that the PRC now has a total of 92 port projects outside of China, with 13 of these port projects having a majority Chinese ownership nowadays. Some of these locations are in Myanmar, Peru, Australia, Sri Lanka, Turkey, Piraeus, Valencia, Bilbao, Cameroon, Togo, Lekki, Netherlands, and Brazil. And something that I find really striking here as a researcher is that these aren't only locations in countries that have historically aligned with the PRC, but also in countries that the United States has partnered with and still continues to partner with, like Australia and the European Union countries. And truly, this massive investment campaign by the PRC into these port locations has helped the PRC gain an enormous advantage in maritime commerce, as well as the ability to gain insights into port and terminal operations abroad, supply chains, as well as insight into the global good and cargo flows. And I think that is especially important, as written by Mark today, when you think about that 80% of the global trade volume, 90% of military equipment and supplies travel via ship and sea. Now, moving more towards military facilities, as well as the potential to use ports as dual-use facilities, something that really I have been watching is that in 2015, the PRC had no overseas base. The following year, by 2016, it had one in Djibouti, the PLA Logistics Support Facility. By June 2022, a PRC official confirmed that the PLA would have access to parts of the Cambodian Ream Naval Base. So since 2015, the PRC has gone from having 0 locations to 2 of them. And recent reports in the few months from the Department of Defense, as well as the Office of the Director of National Intelligence Annual Threat Assessment, have outlined further efforts by the PRC to expand between these 2 global locations to further locations such as Burma, Cuba, Equatorial Guinea, Pakistan, Seychelles, Sri Lanka, Tajikistan, Tanzania, and the United Arab Emirates. Beyond, well, with the exception of Tajikistan, of course, all of these locations are in countries where China has heavily invested into ports and maritime infrastructure. But perhaps beyond these bases and military installation that the PRC now is pursuing abroad, what worries have arisen now also over the potential of these ports becoming dual-use facilities, especially in those locations where China is modernizing, constructing, and investing in, which would allow the PLN to dock at these locations perhaps for port calls, replenishment, refuel, resupply, as well as research operations that may have military uses. One example that I would like to draw out here, and maybe expand on further in discussion later on, is the port of Hambantota, which in 2017 went on a 99-year lease to China, and in the recent 2 years has seen the docking of 2 research vessels. And recently, Sri Lanka has actually imposed a research moratorium, a 1-year moratorium on foreign research vessels. Now, thinking about what this truly all means, and I would like to reference here to Mark's article that came out today in summarizing this. In fact, it is not much of an exaggeration to say that the US owns no commercial ships, has no way to build them, and has nowhere to dock them. As a result, America is highly reliant on foreign partners, some allied, some not, for its economic security. Perhaps it is truly time to think about a comprehensive international maritime strategy and thinking about which ports are truly important for U.S. national security and its economic security. The Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, in November of last year has made a first step when it invested over $500 million into the Port of Colombo to open a new container terminal there together with the Indian-led Adani Group. I think that is one of the first signs that the United States can partner with other countries, but we shouldn't only be doing that on one basis, but rather thinking about how can we both do that in the short and long term together with our partners in other countries. I think I'll leave it here.
Thank you, Leah. So you've made clear that we have much to be concerned about with international ports. Professor Caverly says we have much to be worried about when it comes to economic coercion. I'm not sure that Ron is going to be leaving us in a happier thought about shipbuilding, but Ron, please give us your insight.
Thank you for having me here today. I'll put myself under the same kind of disclaimer that John did at the beginning and add to it that as a CRS analyst, I can talk about options, but CRS does not make policy recommendations. Both of the other speakers have focused a lot on our competition with China. More than any other thing, it's why we're here today. In my own report on China's naval modernization effort, I present the raw relative numbers over time of Chinese and U.S. Navy ships, and that's a one-dimensional measure of naval capability, but to the extent that you do want to use it, there's a graph now that in the report that plots that data. And when I began the China Naval Modernization Report that I maintain at CRS back in 2005, there was very little awareness of this situation. In the years since then, lack of awareness has changed to awareness. Awareness has changed into concern, and most recently, concern has changed to alarm over the situation. You may have seen the press reports about China having 230-something times as much shipbuilding capacity as us. I think that's a raw measure of commercial cargo ship productive capability. That doesn't mean they have 230 times as much naval warship production capability as we do. They can certainly build the shells of those warships, but they don't necessarily have 230 times as much ability to build combat systems and weapons to install on those. So they can build some kinds of ships, certainly at a much faster rate than we can. Commercial cargo ships, simpler naval auxiliaries. Warships are another question. But even taking that into account, they certainly have plenty of warship production. And my CBO colleague, Eric Labs, has pointed out that if a war were to occur, even if in the tactical sense, in the war of itself, if we were able to fight things to a standstill or even putatively win that war, that doesn't mean we would win the post-war situation, because if there are massive losses of naval capability on both sides as a consequence of the war, as a lot of war games suggest there might be, then China could recover from that situation with its naval warship shipbuilding capability a lot quicker than we could. So we might fight them to a standstill or even beat them in a war, but we might lose the post-war situation all the same, as Eric has pointed out. So in shipbuilding capacity, where are the issues? Shipbuilding and ship maintenance. We face constraints on new construction for submarines, for certain parts of the surface ship area, although there's also some unused capacity for surface ships. For ship maintenance, we have capacity constraints for maintaining the nuclear-powered ships, and that's led to a maintenance backlog for the attack submarines. These constraints exist for both shipyards and supplier firms, and a lot of our suppliers are single sources. Workforce limitations are a common thread through all this. There's also a challenge in conducting maintenance on the conventional surface ships, but the Navy has explained to Eric and I on multiple occasions that this is actually not primarily capacity related, but it rather relates to problems in planning, scheduling, and the funding of the work. I point all this out because these capacity limitations are in certain parts of the situation, in certain ways. Some of it is in the public sector yards, some of it is in the private sector yards. There's been a lot of commingling of a lot of these things and discussions, and that can lead to confusion about what the problems are and what the solutions might be. I've got 4 more points I want to make. And the first of those is that the capacity issues that we face for shipbuilding can be viewed as part of a larger situation in 3 ways. The first is that the Navy is currently facing challenges in building ships, but also in crewing ships, and, as I mentioned, in maintaining ships. That's pretty much everything. Secondly, it's part of a larger situation in the sense that the workforce challenges faced by the shipyards are part of a larger societal limitation that we're facing on the availability of people to do pretty much anything, not just shipbuilding, not just DoD, but American society as a whole. And third, challenges in finding people to crew your naval ships is not a problem limited to the Navy. The other U.S. services face challenges with recruiting, and so does the Coast Guard over in the Department of Homeland Security. And other navies internationally are facing problems finding people to crew their ships, as we can see with New Zealand and Australia, and perhaps to some degree with the UK as well. Next point I want to make is to talk a bit about, well, what's being done to address this situation, because stuff is already being done to address it. For the capacity issue with building submarines, I'm going to use the royal we here. just to keep my words short, but we're pouring a lot of money into the submarine construction industrial base. There's more than $10 billion going into that, either from prior years requested for this year or programmed in future years. That money's going both to the shipyards and to the supplier firms. It's for both capital plant and workforce development. The submarine industry has a lot of workforce development initiatives underway, including the advertising that you may have seen on television or even in the metro system around town. And the submarine industry is using a lot more strategic outsourcing, which means that they are relying on firms outside the shipyards to not simply build the pumps and valves like supplier firms do, but actually to build structures that go into the ship. There are about 17 of these strategic outsourcing firms in the submarine effort, including 3 larger ones that are referred to as focus factories. For the surface combatant situation, we're putting money into that as well. For the maintenance of nuclear-powered ships, there's a major investment plan underway for the public sector naval shipyards. For the maintenance of conventional surface ships, like I said, it's not, the Navy says, primarily capacity related. It relates to planning, scheduling, and funding. So the Navy's just trying to do a better job of that, to dig themselves out of the hole that they have gotten themselves into on conventional surface ship maintenance. All right, so if you're doing all those things, and what further actions have been proposed? And one of those is a broader effort to revitalize the maritime industry, industries in general. And there's multiple potential reasons why someone might support that. One of them, only one of them, would be that there might be a knock-on effect in supporting our naval shipbuilding capacity. But if that is the motive or the reason why someone might be interested in doing it, then there are some comments or some issues that can be raised in relation to that. First of all, there's been some encouragement of investment by Asian shipbuilders to invest in the United States, presumably by either setting up commercial shipbuilding yards or expanding existing ones. There's nothing from stopping Asian or other foreign firms from doing this, and 2 foreign firms have already done something like that in the naval area. Austal, the Australian firm, set up Austal USA as a Navy warship builder back in '99, and Fincantieri, the big Italian shipbuilder, purchased an existing shipyard, Marinette Marine in Wisconsin, which is one of our other builders. So this has happened. And if Asian or other foreign shipbuilders want to do more of it in the future, they can do that if it makes economic sense for them to do so. I don't see a plausible path for rebuilding the commercial shipbuilding industry that has been identified other than simply reestablishing the construction differential subsidy that supported commercial ship construction until the Reagan administration canceled it in 1981. So you could certainly revive commercial ship construction in this country if you were to reinstate a subsidy like that, but that would be an ongoing subsidy. It would continue indefinitely, and it would be at significant cost, and supporters of this path would need to compete against other claimants for federal money to win the argument for why it should be spent on doing that. And it's not clear, even if you were to do that, how it would help naval shipbuilding in certain ways. First of all, if you establish commercial yards in this country for building commercial ships, all you're doing is creating a competitor for the workforce that the naval shipyards are trying to find. Secondly, the workers at the commercial yards are going to be busy building the commercial ships. It's not like they're going to have a lot of spare time to walk over to the naval shipyard and help the Navy build Navy ships. Third, it's not clear that you would even want that to happen. If you look at the Asian yards, they actually avoid mixing the workforces of the commercial and the naval shipbuilding activities because the skills and practices that are used in building commercial ships can differ from those used in building naval ships. There's one shipyard in South Korea where there's actually a fence, a chain link fence with a barbed wire top on it that prevents those 2 workforces from mixing because the company doesn't want that to happen. And then lastly, people look at satellite photographs and they see warships being built in Chinese shipyards that also build commercial ships. So they think somehow that's a good way of doing things. But that doesn't mean those warships in those Chinese yards are being built efficiently. They could be being built there for other reasons. For example, in some cases, China may choose to build warships in those yards that build commercial cargo ships as a way of maintaining workloads and employment levels in those yards during times of downturn in international demand for commercial cargo ships. And secondly, in some cases, it can represent an acceptance by Chinese officials for simply building naval ships inefficiently, because that can be for them a less expensive path than spending a lot of money to establish additional specialist navalist shipbuilding capacity. So the fact that the Chinese do it doesn't mean it's necessarily being done efficiently, and therefore doesn't necessarily mean it's an efficient model for us to follow. And my final point relates to, all right, if there's problems with that kind of a solution for Navy shipbuilding, then what are some things that might be out there as things that we can do? And I'll give you 7 examples. 1, you can simply increase worker pay and benefits to help get people into the yards. The differential in their pay and benefit package between them and working in service industries like at fast food places has narrowed. And people will choose to work in the fast food places even if it pays less, because it offers a much more comfortable lifestyle for them than working in a shipyard. It varies a lot from one program to the next, but very roughly, or as a notional example, something like 40% of the cost of a Navy ship is shipyard labor. And just to keep the math simple and notional, not to say that this is the right number, but if you increase the pay and benefit package by 50%, then what you're doing is you're making the ship as a whole 20% more expensive. So you can do that, and there's already some evidence that it will help get people into the yards, but we need to accept that it could mean an increase in the cost. It will mean an increase in the cost of the ships. Again, my CBO colleague Eric Labs points out a second thing, which is that you can change the mix of ships being built for the Navy to include a larger share of smaller ships. That can bring smaller shipyards into the mix that cannot participate in Navy shipbuilding right now for building ships that are too large for them to build. Third, you can move in a more larger scale way to what I refer to as federated shipbuilding. This would be an expansion of strategic outsourcing beyond submarines to incorporate all Navy shipbuilding, surface ships and submarines on a more comprehensive, systematic, and nationwide basis. I refer to it as going inland for Navy shipbuilding to build chunks of ships that would be sent to the coast, although some of those federated shipbuilding sites can also be on the coast themselves. This would allow you to access labor markets that have not already been tapped out for their potential to generate young people who might be interested in going in shipbuilding because they've never done it in those parts of the country before. If you need a term to refer to this idea, in shorthand you can call it, like I do, nation as a shipyard. Next idea, you can make naval ships easier to build by adopting South Korea's approach of loosening up the designs and puffing them up a little bit and optimizing the producibility of each section for producibility rather than using size and weight as a strict proxy for cost. And both SNAME and ASME have talked about doing this in recent years. Next up, you can move away from building the Navy as a collection of individual bespoke ship designs and towards something that's a little bit more coordinated from one class to the next. At a minimum, this would mean increased cross-class production engineering between ship designs, and more broadly, it would mean redesigning the Navy toward a more comprehensive kit of parts approach in which standard components go into standard systems that are incorporated into ready-to-go hull designs, the Navy as a kit of parts. Next up, you could move to continuous steady production rate, avoiding starts and stops in shipbuilding programs and continually changing annual quantities. You can follow Japan's example on submarines in this regard. They build one submarine per year on a steady drumbeat, pretty much regardless of what their intended force size is. So when they planned a submarine force of 16 boats, they simply kept the boats to age 16. When they decided to expand their submarine force to 22, they still built the boats at one per year, they just kept them to age 22. And they have the option of expanding their force further to 30 boats, again, without making any changes in their production rate. So instead of trying to manicure things at the front end through starts and stops in production rates, build things at a steady rate and manage the force size at the back end through service life and retirement decisions. The idea would be to be generally right rather than precisely wrong about future requirements, and begin thinking of the Navy not as a number to be achieved precisely in a future year, but rather as a general idea for a larger Navy that you would get to by building ships in various categories at certain steady rates. And then finally, two more things. You could take all this and move more broadly to redesign the Navy to become fundamentally easier to build, crew, and maintain. And you would do that with an eye toward, among other things, requiring fewer people to do each of those things. And the way to do it is by initiating an activity that the Navy has not had to do in the past but might be advisable in the future, which is upfront, broad-scale, end-to-end design work for the entire fleet. Kind of astonishingly, the Navy has not done that. They haven't had to in the past, but they might as well. All these ideas that I've just given to you, I've talked about in 3 public presentations that I've given at professional conferences at the January 23 Surface Navy Association Symposium, the December 23 Naval Institute Defense Forum, Washington, and the January 24 Surface Navy Association Symposium. And you can see these things online, and if you're interested, I can point you to the links so that you can see my presentations on these things in more detail. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Ron, and thanks for that collection of ideas. I'm going to be turning it over to the audience here to have some questions. I could fill up the day with questions, but let me start out. Please turn over your tent card with a name facing me, or if you don't have one, just raise it. And we would look forward, just tip them up on its side if you have a question. Make sure you're pushing the green button, and I'll look for the first question if we have one here. It's got to be a brave soul out there somewhere. Okay, go ahead. And if you could state who you are.
Sure.
As well.
Lou Krishak from the Polar Institute here at the Wilson Center. Just a question, in terms of the shipbuilding needs and crewing needs, could a national service program be a way to answer both of those at the same time? It's a big swing, I know.
Anybody want to take on that question?
Yeah, that gets into the broader category of pipelines for getting people into, and that can help. My sense is that that both industry and the Navy are exploring pipelines like that within the traditional Navy shipbuilding areas geographically. A national service sort of thing like that can reach other areas of the country that traditionally have not been involved in shipbuilding, and can therefore possibly be of help in terms of tapping into labor markets that have not already been squeezed tight already the way they have in the traditional shipbuilding areas. And by the way, for this federated shipbuilding, that doesn't mean that that they would be owned by other people. The existing shipbuilders can set up these sites themselves if they choose to. They can be the owners of these things that are more distributed across the country. The ownership of this is agnostic, but yeah, that is one way of doing it. But the general idea that I try to focus on is reaching parts of the country that have not traditionally had a lot of exposure to shipbuilding, because it has been concentrated a lot on the coasts for ship structures and final assembly. Technology now can allow more of that work to take place in what I refer to as these quote-unquote inland sites, although some of them also can be coastal.
Just a quick response and then a question back to Ron, who knows vastly more about this than I ever will. It takes a long time to train a moderately useful shipyard worker, and so national service would have to be a fairly significant length of time. So I'm just asking Ron, what's the range of apprenticeship to training that you would need in order to actually revitalize shipbuilding?
Yeah, it depends on exactly what that person's doing in the shipyard, but getting up to what used to be referred to as journeyman levels of proficiency can take anywhere from a few years to several years, depending on the specialty. Submarine welders are often cited as the long pole in the tent on that. As we get a lot of young people into the yards, if you're successful doing that, you do have to think about what their productivity is. And a lot of them are coming into the yards without any prior wrench turning experience, because unlike previous generations, when young people come into the yards today, They don't have prior experience fixing dad's car that were up on the cinder blocks on the driveway. They were just like doing things with their phones when they were growing up. So they're starting from a very low baseline, but they do and they can learn quickly, and technology does allow that. And there's even some evidence that augmented reality and things can help destroy the learning curve and accelerate things further. But there will be a learning process. And so when you bring a lot of people into a yard and staff up, not just to increase a yard from 10 to 15,000, you have to do more than 5,000 to do that because other people are retiring in the meantime. So it's more than 5,000 new workers if those are the notional numbers. And they all have lower productivity for a while. So you have a green labor issue within the shipyard. So if you've staffed up a lot, you have a larger segment than you used to in the past of green labor. And here's something else that we'll have to look for over the next 5 or 10 years. Those young people that you bring into the yards may decide not to be lifers. They may have this career path that a lot of them talk about, oh, I'm going to move from one thing to another. I'm not staying in the same place for my whole life, not even necessarily the same industry. Now, we'll have to wait and see whether they make good on that and whether that happens. But if it does, then you won't just have a green labor issue from staffing up originally. You will have more of a permanent increased percentage of your workforce at any time being green labor because you'll have more turnover. And I call that the evergreen issue. We don't know whether we will face that or not, but that is a possibility. And you will have to plan for that and adapt your ship designs and construction methods for that.
Well, as someone who never lived in a town of more than 500 until I graduated from college and grew up in the center of the country in Minnesota, the idea of bringing that work inland seems like a dream come true for many rural areas. Carrie, please.
Hello, I'm Carrie Davis, President and CEO of the American Association of Port Authorities. And I hope this is a fair question. Just tell me if it's too tough to answer or you just don't know. Why is this part of our military industrial base so different than other modalities and branches of the military, like air or ground or now space? Commerce and militarization is super hot here in Washington and elsewhere. Why, either on the demand side or the supply side, why is the situation so dire here? Or is it problematic across all the modalities and branches?
I just want to add a point to Carrie's excellent question. I spent yesterday with the Space Force, and, of their 3 priorities for Space Command, be ready for 2017 is one of those. When I look at the challenges that you talked about here and the pace of change to meet those challenges, 2017 doesn't seem to be as front of mind in the maritime sphere. So just building on Carrie's question, does anybody want to talk about are we in a worse shape in the maritime sphere than we are in others? If so, why?
I'll take a shot. I think one thing I try to emphasize when I teach and research about naval ships, and again, I'm not an expert on civilian shipbuilding, is the political economic process of building a ship is just vastly different than any other product that the United States Department of Defense is going to buy. It takes a decade to design. It takes many years to build, right? And then you're going to be operating the ship for 30 to 50 years. Right? And these are massive capital expenditures. They tend to be very politically salient because they're built in only a few different places. And so you really need a giant coalition to build and maintain a fleet that is not the same for the Army, the Air Force, or even Space Force. And that's another thing to think about. When you think about building a fleet, understand that you are stuck with it for a generation, and that's going to shape your foreign policy in a way that building the next generation aircraft is going to do. So that's one possible explanation. It's just a very different industry, and the timelines are much longer, and it's much more expensive, and it's much more permanent.
I am no expert on domestic shipbuilding, so I will refer to John and Ron's expertise on this matter.
I guess what I would add is I don't know for a fact that this sector is clearly worse off than others because I don't know enough about the other sectors to make a judgment about that. But the sector clearly faces challenges. And people will often posit two sort of overarching reasons for that at the sort of societal level, which I think was sort of what your question was pitched at. And one is the phenomenon referred to in short as sea blindness, which is that we live on the land and we don't usually look at the oceans very much unless we're at the beach doing something recreational, and there just isn't a lot of consciousness on a day-to-day basis about the world's oceans or our existence as a maritime country, as effectively an island country unto ourselves. And the other reason that's often thrown out, again, at the general level, is that this is viewed as a very long-standing and mature industry, which means it's not the exciting, shiny new object the way electronics and other sectors are. So when there are growth sectors in other parts of American society, that's the new thing that everybody's rushing into: crypto, AI, quantum, you name it. Well, you know, the maritime industries are not one of those things. And so they tend not to be on people's minds. And so those are two things that people sometimes will throw out. I don't know how far they go in explaining that, but I do think they are challenges for the sector. It is a long-standing, mature sector, not the bright, shiny new object that is captivating everybody.
Helpful, thanks. I think we need like the Blue Angels for the Navy or something like that, you know what I mean?
We perhaps do, but you say it's not the bright, shiny object. I don't know of anything more exhilarating than being out in a carrier in the middle of the ocean with the wind blowing in your face. But down in the, I can't quite make it out from here. Natalie.
Yeah, that's right. This is Natalie Shen from the Department of State, Bureau of Econ and Business Affairs. So, you know, your point about providing incentives for young people to enter the industry, I think this also has broader implications as we're trying to onshore or reshore a lot of U.S. industry. What are some incentives that could bring folks into this industry, especially when I think over the past decade, at least when I was growing up, the really only exposure we got to shipbuilding was that mesothelioma ads on TV. That's when you knew about a shipbuilding industry. And so, like, beyond purely financial, and what might be the cost implications for shipbuilding?
Yeah,
Over.
I'm with you on the mesothelioma ads, you know, because during the pandemic when we were all working at home, I'm watching some of those secondary television channels, you know, during the midday hours, and you see a lot of those ads. Well, the other exposure, and also related to your question earlier, you know, about, you know, why is the sector in such trouble? Usually the only way you see ports and docks and things like that on American television are in the final scenes of a fictional crime television series where the bad guys somehow always wind up down on the docks trying to hide from the police. I mean, how many times have we seen the Port of Los Angeles depicted that way as an inexpensive backlot, you know, when they don't want to use the universal backlot there? Well, you know, if you keep showing people images like that, I have to wonder whether it has an impact on somebody's idea of whether that would be a great place to work. If it's this lonely place where, you know, if you run into somebody, it might be somebody with a gun who's in the midst of committing crime or protecting themselves from the police or something. So that's an issue. I've talked about raising wages and benefits. The other area, one that Navy officials have talked about, is improving quality of life for people working, and that can mean improving the housing. They've been priced out of some of the housing markets in the traditional shipyard areas just because other people have flowed into those areas. Or simple things like building parking lots so that they can actually drive to the shipyard instead of drive to a remote site, then get on a shuttle bus, only then to get to the shipyard. This can have an effect. So there are things you can do along those lines as well, in addition to the main event that I talked about, which is looking at the possibility or the possible need for having to substantially increase wages.
I just want to reiterate what I said in my comments. I mean, the problems of shipbuilding are not just confined to the United States. And if you look at South Korea and Japan, these are two countries that are not necessarily the most pro-immigration countries on the planet, and yet they are staffing their shipyards with foreign guest workers.
And Aaliyah, if I ask you, we're thankful that that you have been attracted to the ports scene, which is equally a concern. We may be able to build the ships, but we also once we get beyond our shores, need ports that they can go into during a time of geopolitical stress. What resistance have you seen attracting attention to the ports outside the U.S.? Clearly, you've dug in and you happen to have grown up in a port town, so that maybe gave you more awareness. But how can we raise more awareness of the ports issues that you are investigating?
That's a fabulous question. So I'm originally from Germany, and I grew up in Duisburg, which is now known as Germany's China City, where China has majorly invested in the biggest inland harbor in the world. So ports have always been on my mind for a little bit. I never actually thought I would work on them, so I hope I'm making my hometown really proud on that. I think one of the biggest things that I can think about and really thinking continuously about ports is not only reacting to them on a one-on-one case basis, but rather forming proactive strategies. We're seeing right now when we're talking about ports that only really when bad things happen or bad examples come up that we respond to them, but rather I think we need to think about them proactively in a positive manner. So for example, DFC's investment that I mentioned earlier into Colombo, that happened after China got a 99-year lease of the Hambantota port, but rather maybe we need to be thinking about what are ports where we can positively contribute to proactively. I think that is one of the biggest steps we can do right now.
Great. Further questions down here? Go ahead, Ryan.
Hello, Ryan Sullivan from State Department, also in the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. I just had a clarifying question for Ron, and you were mentioning the construction differential and the competition between commercial shipbuilding and naval shipbuilding being, kind of detrimental to naval shipbuilding. But one might argue that supporting both private and public shipyards helped the industry flourish together. And yes, there might be some cross-pollination between the two, but I just wanted to clarify, did you mean that, supporting commercial shipyards would be a detriment overall?
What I was saying is that it would be a competitor. And what I hear sometimes from some people who want to revitalize the commercial industries broadly, including commercial shipbuilding, in some cases, their argument for doing it is that they think it's going to help naval shipbuilding. And I'm not sure they've thought that through for the reasons that I mentioned. I'm not saying it would be a detriment to naval shipbuilding, although it could be if you establish a commercial shipbuilder and that shipbuilder winds up competing for the same people that the naval construction yards are trying to recruit into their yards. We've already seen an expression of concern from the Navy about this situation down on the Gulf Coast, just as it relates to government shipbuilding only. This person was at a professional conference just a few weeks or months ago, and he noted all the Navy and Coast Guard shipbuilding programs that are now being assigned to shipyards on the Gulf Coast. And there's a long tradition in the labor force down on the Gulf Coast of moving between shipyards and between military and non-military industrial activities. You can be building a Navy ship and then you quit that job and go build oil derricks for the oil industry down there and back and forth. So it's kind of like one big labor pool down there. And he expressed the concern that there are now a lot of programs going into the yards on the Gulf Coast, just the military programs. And he says, I don't know what that's going to do to our labor costs because all those yards now are going to be competing for the same labor. And so he was expressing that concern over competition for labor just inside the military shipbuilding sphere. If you then layer on top of that additional commercial ship construction activity, then you're adding other players who are chasing the same pool of workers. And so there is a possibility that if you were to establish commercial yards in this country, depending on where they were located, they could wind up competing within the same regional labor pools for workers that might otherwise have gone to shipyards in that same region that are building naval ships. And in that way, yeah, it could be a problem for the yards constructing the naval ships.
I would just say, when you look at the projections for China shipbuilding versus ours, we're going to need a lot more Navy construction in the near term. And if you get into the scenario of a conflict, to replenish losses in a hurry, We're some orders of magnitude away from where we need to be
Right, and
in
The al-
just
the al-
military shipbuilding.
right, I mean, and the alternative to pouring a lot of money and time and effort into reviving the commercial ship industry, if your motive for doing that is that somehow that will have a roundabout benefit on naval shipbuilding, the alternative to doing that is simply to invest money in more specialist naval shipbuilding facilities. We are in effect doing that by pouring all that money now into the submarine construction industrial base, to some degree in the large surface combatant industrial base, and there's more potential even for doing that. There are places in this country where if you decide to spend the money, you could set up specialist naval shipbuilding yards. You could do that down at Ingalls on the East Bank. You could do that at Philly in Philadelphia. You might do that at Vigor up in the Pacific Northwest. And so the question becomes, if your end goal is to increase our specialist naval or our naval shipbuilding capacity, then the way to do it possibly is simply through direct investment in more capacity of that kind, not by investing in commercial shipbuilding industry and hoping that we'll have a roundabout benefit of some kind. Again, I'm not sure that's been thought through, that it would have any roundabout benefit, and it might even be a situation where you're setting up a competitor for what is now very scarce labor.
Okay, I guess we have a couple more questions here I'd like to take. I can't see your place card here. So it's Colin, if we could grab your question, and then we'll go to Nick, and we'll wrap those together.
Thank you. Colin Grabo with the Cato Institute. Colin Grabo with the Cato Institute. John, twice you mentioned the fact that South Korea relies on guest labor. You highlight Vietnam. I think you even read about Nepal, people from there going to South Korea. If you do a Google search, you can find numerous examples of U.S. shipyards, particularly on the Gulf Coast, being raided by immigration authorities and carting off undocumented workers at the same time that we have this labor shortage. Is there scope for discussion about immigration reform as part of the solution to these workforce challenges? Are these conversations taking place? Are there possible risks to that? And if you don't mind, a second question. Last year, CNN had an article about the differential between U.S. and Japanese shipbuilding costs for naval vessels. I think Blake Hertzinger was quoted in there and some others. Could you speak, Ron, to the differential between U.S. and Japanese naval shipbuilding costs? I think they were quoted saying Japanese ships were roughly 1/3 the cost of U.S. ships. How much of that factors reflects U.S. shipyard inefficiency or relative inefficiency versus the design work that goes into to these on the naval side, maybe in over-designed vessels? So appreciate it.
And Nick, if we could grab your questions at the same time.
Yeah, mine's relatively quick. You sort of alluded to some of these issues in your presentations, all three of you, in some way, shape, or form. Obviously, we have a manpower issue across the board, whether it's building or crewing. My company has invested a lot in technology and modernizing and integrating systems to make things much more efficient. That's sort of our raison d'etre right this minute. My question is, are there technological solutions? I think Ron alluded to some, substituting some manpower by redesigning the ship. But are there for building, crewing, and substituting, for example, the drone concept that has largely been adopted in the Air Force and Army, having them piloted from Arizona instead of people in theater? Just curious if there are things we could do. Those are obviously longer term, perhaps.
So somewhat related questions. Who wants to take a crack at that?
I'll do the first and the third real quick. As a policy person, I'm a big fan of incrementalism, and there are many precedents for shaping your immigration policy based on national security needs and economic needs. So I think there's room for that. That's about all I can say, since it's really not my area of expertise, but programs do exist to make sure that we get workers that we need for national security and for economic growth, high-value labor. We haven't even talked about the merchant marine. I mean, that's a separate thing entirely, but your comment brings it up. The one thing about unmanned as a saving labor device is, I like to say, in a weird way, the closer you are to the Earth's core, the harder uncrewed systems are, right? Because up in space, there's nothing's gonna hit. There might be space junk, right? You're not worried about keeping people, but the maintenance and the ability to supervise things, the further you go and you start hitting salt water and you start going under salt water, it's not something you can just do from Arizona. You might be able to pilot it from Arizona, but maintaining one of those things requires a lot of labor at this stage.
Very quickly, to add to that and to pick up all the threads that were mentioned, foreign workers in shipyards. It's my understanding that one of our shipyards that does, among other things, build Navy ships actually has foreign workers, and that's NASSCO in San Diego. They are a combined naval and commercial shipbuilder. And the naval ships they build they look kind of like commercial cargo ships. They're simpler and less complex. They're Navy auxiliaries. Part of their workforce comes over the border every day from Mexico. They're probably being put into the commercial ship side. I don't know for a fact that they're participating in the construction of the Navy ships. But in any event, the Navy ships that are built there are less complex and perhaps technologically less sensitive than certainly what we're building in some of the other yards. But there already is, to my understanding, a shipyard in this country, NASSCO, that has foreign workers as a part of its workforce every day. The cost differential between us and the Asian yards has narrowed over time as standards of living and wages and prices have gone up in Asia. When I first started at CRS, and that was 40 years ago, the person I was succeeding, and they kept him and me together for 3 years before he retired, at that point in time, that was 40-something years ago, he said, well, Ron, they can build a ship in South Korea for the same cost as the tax that you would pay on the cost of a ship built in the United States. That's how big the differential was back then. It's narrowed considerably since then because wages and prices and standards of living have risen so spectacularly in those countries. So it's probably a lot narrower now than it once was. But that differential may still exist, and it may be larger than what you can overcome through learning curve benefits of having established a practice in this country and then getting down your learning curve. You may still have something that becomes the thing that you would need to subsidize on a continuing basis as long as you wanted to do it. That would not necessarily ever go away. And that adds up to a larger federal expenditure over time that if you were arguing in favor of it, then that's what you would have to present as the thing that you were defending. And it's potentially not an insignificant amount of money on an ongoing basis. In terms of the other question, substituting for people and unmanned, as you know, the Navy has large unmanned surface and underwater vehicles as part of its future force structure, the LSUV, the MUSV, and the XLUUV in particular. They are now presented as a part of the Navy's future force structure, although they've decided not to count them as battle force ships. They're still on the table of what they want to do in the future. And for me, the thing to watch is how fast they can bring the LUSV online. And that got pushed off another 2 years in the most recent shipbuilding plan. So instead of getting the first production model in this year's budget, FY25, that's now been put off another 2 years. They're trying to mature the technologies. Other people like Brian Clark and Tim Walton have talked about building them sooner as lightly manned or partially manned or optionally manned ships, and then converting them into unmanned ships when the autonomy technologies and the machinery plant durability technologies are sufficiently matured. And they saw that as a way of starting to build those things sooner, rather than waiting for all the technologies for fully unmanned operations to be mature before you start building them, which is the Navy's current path. But in my view, the Navy needs to re-engineer itself to take people out of all phases of this, out of building, crewing, and maintaining. You take people out of building by making the ships more standardized as a kit of parts, simpler, and perhaps also by loosening up the designs so that the spaces can be accessed more easily by the workers when they're building them. You take people out of the crewing by moving more toward automation, and that will require the Navy to re-examine its ship manning and station practices, watchstanding practices. And then you can take people out of maintaining also in part by going to the kit of parts approach. But the Navy will have to look at doing that rather than discovering at the back end that it has a challenge in building, crewing, and maintaining ships, and then trying to address those problems after they occur through ad hoc, after the fact, whack-a-mole-like efforts. If that is the only way the Navy attempts to address these problems, it's my view that the problems will never go away. They will never catch up on that. They instead, in my view, need to go back to the front end and recognize that people are a fundamentally more scarce commodity in American society. We now need to fit the Navy into that situation and adjust the Navy to the domestic ecosystem, if you will, in that way. The Navy traditionally has been designed primarily looking outward toward the threat and saying, if that's the threat, this is the Navy I want to build, and then you ask the interior ecosystem to build it. And we haven't had to worry about the ability of the American ecosystem to build whatever it is the Navy says it wants based on looking outward. Now the Navy's, I think, going to have to look more inward toward that ecosystem and saying, if these are the strengths and also the limitations and constraints of American society, what then is the right Navy for us to try to build to address that external threat? And that's a Navy that could look different than the one that we traditionally have planned for ourselves for the future.
Well, we've certainly laid out a lot of questions here. We have some exploratory conversations on possible solutions. I think we all agree that this is vitally important to America's future, so we look forward to continuing to explore these. I thank everybody for being here today. Thanks for being part of this program, and please stay tuned for future programming in this area of maritime industry around the world. Thank you.